I thought about this morning as I was thinking about the time we were beginning that Shabbat has just begun in Israel. So in Jerusalem, everything is now shut down. People are already lighting the Sabbath candles. If you've ever been in Jerusalem, particularly in Jerusalem itself, which is the very religious city, everything gets quiet. It's like Jesse's fog out there. It's like everything becomes a different atmosphere completely, and it's really quite something. So today we want to just look at this very central idea of time, the Sabbath, and I've added the word survival, but hopefully we can move toward an understanding of how the Sabbath is a search for eternity, is what I call it, when you're keeping the Sabbath. And so I'm a big book person, and I know that Angela's a big book person as well. And some of you others that I don't know as well probably are too. But I do want to start by introducing some of the books that I'm going to be talking from. One of them is here. This is, here you go. The Sabbath, by Abraham Joshua Heschel, probably one of the most important rabbis of the 20th century. He died in about 1975. I knew him from being in Alabama and being a journalist in Birmingham, Alabama during the Civil Rights Movement. And he marched with Dr. King in the famous march across the Selma Bridge, but is quite a philosopher and teacher. Another book that I'm going to mention, I don't have it to hold up because I just loaned it to a grandson who's working with a Jewish lawyer in Washington, D.C. right now. And he wanted to understand better what this Sabbath thing was about. And Senator Joseph Lieberman wrote a book recently, not too terribly long ago, called The Gift of Rest, with the subtitle, Rediscovering the Beauty of the Sabbath. In that book, Senator Lieberman takes us through what it's like as an Orthodox Jew to celebrate the Sabbath. So he takes you actually through how they do that in their family and what that means as a senator when he'd have to go in and stay late on a Friday night to do an important vote or something. So it's a kind of an interesting inside look of a religious Jewish family and how they celebrate the Sabbath and what it means to them. Another book I'll mention, which is by Thomas Cahill. He's the guy who wrote the book, How the Irish Saved Civilization, some years ago. But he also wrote a book called The Gift of the Jews, with a subtitle, How a Tribe of Desert Nomads Changed the Way Everyone Thinks and Feels. Now, that book, this gift of the Jews that Thomas Cahill is talking about, is the gift of how the Jews introduced linear history or linear time frame. Eastern religions, for instance, work on a cyclical, there's no end, it just goes around in a circle. Biblical Judaism points out the fact that there's a beginning and there's an end. And so linear time comes in, and that's what he calls the gift of the Jews. And then finally, not finally, but another book that I recommend is this very huge tome. See how thick it is? Okay. This is Edishine's The Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah. Now, Edishine was one of those 19th century rabbis who knew Mishnah, Talmud, the Gemara, and then came to faith in Jesus. There were a number of those in the 19th century of people like this from Eastern Europe who came to faith out of a rabbinic Talmudic background. So his book really is an amazing thing. And as you can see, it's very thick and heavy, but very interesting. Now, one last book I'll mention along our topic, and that's this one, which is Rich Robinson, who's the research director for Jews for Jesus, who wrote this book, Christ in the Sabbath. And I just find this one of the most helpful books. So I'll get to that a little bit toward the end of this time. Now, so some of our goals today are just to have a greater understanding and appreciation of the Jewish contribution to thinking for us biblical people. And one of the things that sort of intrigues me, especially as I read Heschel's take on the Sabbath and his thoughts on the Sabbath about time and space, and we're going to talk about that first, is just how really close to an understanding of the beauty of Sabbath, how close it is to our understanding of Jesus himself, and yet how far away it is in so many ways. It's like one more step and they'd be there, kind of thing. So, but they have so much to teach us about appreciating God's gift of Sabbath and the importance of it. And then, of course, we finally want to look at Jesus and his worldview in his world of the Second Temple period that he lived in, which is the goal of all of our shorish study programs. I know some of you have already been on those trips, but we're looking at Jesus in his Second Temple period setting and what his words actually mean, so that we can understand better what Jesus was saying, what he was saying, and what was behind what he was saying. So we want to look at that before this time is over. We're hoping to, I'm looking at the clock, I've got about 45 minutes here, so we'll try to get through this time within the hour. Now, remember when we're talking about Jewish things that you have to have two hands, because we say on one hand and on the other hand. Okay, so that's a good Jewish thing to keep in mind. We have to remember too that the Judaism of Jesus in his Second Temple period is different from the rabbinic Judaism post AD 70 and the destruction of the temple, when the only sect left from Judaism of Jesus's day were the Pharisees. And so our rabbinic Judaism that we see today was actually built on the Pharisees and what they brought into finally writing down what had been oral law in their day, in the days of Jesus. Okay, so it took on a different thing, because when you think about it, I have this conversation, especially with Orthodox rabbis and Orthodox Jewish people, when they say how important the Torah is and keeping Torah, then I have to ask them, what about all the Levitical sacrifices? Because you can't keep them without the priesthood and without the temple. So it's an interesting point of discussion. We have to remember too that the word sanctify is to set something apart for a sacred reason, for a sacred purpose. And that's what we're going to talk about with Sabbath. And also in Leviticus 23, where all the feasts are listed, and I'm sure you've talked about the feast of the Lord, Sabbath is the first one mentioned. Okay. And then Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 4:18, and we're going to move into this with Rabbi Heschel's thinking. Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians 4:18, we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen. For what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. So let's look a little bit about how Heschel saw all of this. He divides things into what he calls space and time, the difference between space and time. And this is how he defines these words. Space has to do with things, with technology, with man's attempt to conquer or control his world. I mean, God did, after all, say to Adam and Eve, take authority over all this created stuff that I gave you in Genesis 1:27. So for 6 days, man works with things, trying to conquer, control. I mean, we're in COVID, we're trying to control it, right? I mean, this is an urge in man, is to work using technology, things to conquer and control. Words that associate with this thing that Heschel's calling space are things like have, to possess, to control, to subdue, to have power over. In contrast, Heschel uses the word time he calls it the essential ingredient of existence. And it's a concept that's a little bit hard to grasp, but what it is, because it is thingless, that's hard for us to think about. Not about things, it's about being. It moves us into the realm of the spirit and away from things of the flesh or the body. Words about time that we have are things like being, giving, sharing, being in accord with. So these are nice, peaceful words, as opposed to conquering, etc. Now, the word Sabbath is an interesting word. It's the first thing that God calls holy, the kadosh word in Hebrew, kadosh, right in Genesis 2:2 and 2:3. We are called to keep it holy. We are called to set this one side apart. We're even called to be a holy people in Leviticus 19, and 1 Peter picks that up and says, you are to be a holy people. You are God's holy people. You are the set aside, called out ones. Okay, so that's a wonderful thought, and it's applied first to Sabbath. So God is everywhere, and he really doesn't need a material place to be. But it's interesting in scripture when we see the God creating his Hebrew people, his second creation in Genesis 12 with Abram. He calls Abram out, who was a Gentile. There were no such things as Jewish people. But he called to himself a new people. We've had the flood. We've had the Tower of Babel, which was, after all, man's first attempt at globalism. We're going to pull everybody together, have one language, and be a global people. That's not going to happen, obviously, until Jesus comes again and we have the Messianic reign. Then we have true unity of all men. But until then, so what happens about God? He calls his people out. We have the Exodus experience. And it's not until Exodus 32 and the golden calf experience that it's like God says, these people need something to look at. All the pagan world has, because they are in space, we might say, have things. So they have things like golden calves. They worship the stars. They worship the moon. They worship statues of various kinds. They even worship emperors, we find in Daniel, who put up statues to themselves. And it's almost, in my sense, that after the golden calf, it's like God, Moses has to go back to God and say, God, I don't know where to go with this. I mean, here are these people, and we're back to Egypt again. We're going to have all this time together trying to get to the promised land. Where do we go from here? And it's like in God's mercy and understanding and grace that he says, it's right after that he says, now go build the tabernacle. I'll give my people something to look at, and I'll be in the midst of them. That's a really awesome thought, So he builds the tabernacle in the wilderness. There are 2 temples, and interestingly enough, both of them get torn down. We'll talk about that a little bit, where God is saying again, I don't need to belong in space. I'm a spirit. And then Paul says the outlandish thing that you are now the temple of the Holy Spirit, that he's come to dwell in us because of Jesus releasing the Spirit to us. But the idea and the essence of Sabbath, to get back to our Sabbath idea, is completely detached from the world of space. It's a celebration, really, of time over space. So we have to think about that a little bit. Sabbath is turning from this world of space, of creation, to the creator himself of the world, which we would call time. In Genesis 2:2, we've had the 6 days of creation, but on the 7th day, it says God finished or ceased from his work. But he did 3 things on that 7th day, it says in the scripture. He rested, which is the prohibition against labor on the Sabbath. He blessed it, which brings us joy and delight in God's blessing. And then he hallowed it. That is, he sanctified it. He set it apart. It's very interesting because there's a word in Hebrew there that's used in that Genesis 2:2, menucha, which is a rest with none to disturb, tranquility, serenity, peace, repose. It's used in that very familiar Psalm 23 when it says, God leads us, we pray, God lead us by still waters. It's that same menucha word. It's menachot mayim, the still waters. It's a wonderful picture, really, for us. Now, how do we move with this idea of Torah and Sabbath into an idea of eternity? Isaiah 40 says the grass, will wither, but the word of our God stands forever. There's a forever picture here of us moving out of space and into time, and this happens on Sabbath. In fact, after a Jewish person reads Torah, there's a prayer after you read a section of Torah, and it goes something like this: Baruch atem. It's the blessed art thou prayer, who gives us the Torah, who has given us the Torah, and planted within us eternal life. So there is this idea of moving from space into eternity, from things into eternal life, into the spirit. The question that the rabbis had to ask, and this is where on the one hand and on the other hand come in, is, wait a minute, if it says in Joshua 1:8 that this book of Torah shall not depart out of your mouth, okay, that's on one hand. That means, hey, are we supposed to work? Are we supposed to still work if we're supposed to be doing this Torah thing all the time? So to work or not to work, that's the question. So the rabbinic answer to that is, don't flee from work, this space technology thing-centered tools, but be in love with eternity, with time and the spirit. So there's that balance between keep Torah all the time, but work for those 6 days. God gave us 6 days to work, but always have in your heart this idea of eternity and spirit stepping out. Now, in the Jewish thought, the Sabbath is called the bride or the queen. And the rabbis came to this idea because the Talmud interprets to sanctify is a very close word in Hebrew, to betroth. So once the temple was destroyed, the Israel becomes, they see this as the Israel becoming the groom, and Shabbat or Sabbath being the bride, the spirit, almost a living presence. So the joy of preparing for Sabbath is that you're preparing, if the queen was coming to dinner, you'd do some preparation, right? So after the temple is destroyed, Sabbath takes on this role as welcoming the Sabbath. So today would be Erev Shabbat. It's called, the ceremony itself is called Kabbalat Shabbat. That is the Kabbalat, the welcoming. Now, again, we have to use two hands because in one side, the word Kabbalat could mean taking on an obligation, like an obligation to rest or to even rejoice in the Sabbath. The other meaning of Kabbalat is to welcome or to receive or to greet. So what do the rabbis say? Well, on the one hand, it's an obligation, but on the other hand, it's a great moment to welcome, receive, and greet this queen, this bride of the Sabbath. So, okay, let's think more about this, this business of moving into eternity. So for 6 days we work. Now we know that work can bring anxieties and strain and worry. But by Friday, we're all saying, enough already. TGIF, thank God it's Friday. We've had enough of this. We want to get away from this. We need to tone it down. We need to start relaxing a bit. So there's an excitement in even preparing for the Sabbath. You shop, you clean, you cook, because you're not going to do anything else after the sun sets, okay? And you're thinking all the time. You know, I always, when I do this in a church setting, and maybe we'll have a chance to do this at Res sometime in person, because I'm really longing to meet you in person. When we usually start on a Friday evening, and we're preparing, we're going to do an Erev Shabbat meal together. So all the cooking's been done, all the shopping's been done, and we're going to put on our best clothes. And I love that scene in Fiddler on the Roof that many of you have seen, of the Sabbath, where they actually sing, and the husband blesses his wife, and they bless the children around the Sabbath table. It's a beautiful, beautiful preparation time, and everybody's in their best clothes, and the mama puts the cover over her head, and she lights the candles, and she prays, she covers her face, and she prays for her children around the table. It's a beautiful and lovely welcoming time, and it's definitely a setting aside. No more working now. It's all done. We sing at Sabbath preparation. We sing the Song of Songs because we're welcoming the bride. It's a love song. It's an atmosphere of love and passion and nostalgia. What are we nostalgic about? We're looking for Eden again. We're looking for when the beginning of it all, when God said it's good, Zaytov, Zaytov, Zaytov. You know, the only time he said it, Zaylotov, it's not good, is when he said it's not good for man to be alone. And he created a woman from him. So that's a very good thing. But the Heschel writes, a thought has blown the marketplace away. Eternity utters a day. That's the Sabbath day. Sabbath and eternity are of the same essence. It's a move from space to time, from the material world to the spirit. One of the rabbis wrote, unless we can taste eternal life in Shabbat, one will be unable to enjoy eternity in the world to come. The Talmud writes that Sabbath is me'in alom haba. It's like the world to come. So you see how expansive that idea is when we start thinking about the Sabbath. The 6 days of creation, as I said, God said all of it was good. But on the seventh day, he said, it's holy. It's a move from the profane to the sacred. So 6 days, man relates to nature and things, but on the seventh day, man relates to the creator of the nature. Bodies belong to space, but the spirit belongs to time. Heschel writes, we usually think that the earth is our mother, that time is money, and profit our mate. Sabbath reminds us that God is our father, that time is life, and the spirit our mate. These are lovely words, really. Now, world religions, that is pagan religions, know God in space. That's why we mentioned earlier that they worship nature, they worship heavenly bodies, they worship statues, etc. But Judaism brought God in time through his acts of redemption, of salvation. The day of the Lord, he would say, is more precious than the house of the Lord, which is a thing. And I mentioned the Tower of Babel as the first move toward globalism, which happens to come the chapter before God says, enough already. Hey, Abraham, come out of Ur of the Chaldees, you Gentile over there. I've got to do something new here. So he does the new creation. And so we are awaiting the Messianic age that will restore unity to all men, but not now. As we often say about the scriptures and God's plan, we're in the already, but the not now. Not quite yet. We're in the now, but not yet. So again, we have this on the one hand and on the other hand, the balance between God saying, make a place that the Lord your God shall choose in Deuteronomy 12, for instance. And in Psalm 132, the Lord has chosen Zion, my resting place forever. But then in Isaiah 66, he says, heaven is my throne, earth is my footstool. So we have these, again, you got to hold two things at the same time. That's a very Jewish way of thinking, and something that we aren't very good at. We're not very good at holding two, what seem to be conflicting ideas of two sides of a coin, you might think of it as. We either want to say an either or, but it's both and in Jewish thinking. So keep that in your mind as we think about this. They also point out the fact that in the Ten Commandments, which in Hebrew would be called the Esrim Devarim, the 10 words, there's not a mention of a sacred place. It says keep holy the Sabbath, but there's nothing about a building something, okay? So already within the Ten Commandments themselves, we get the idea that there's an eternity, it's about spirit, not things, okay? So what are we trying to achieve when you are celebrating Sabbath, like right now in Israel, and soon here? Jewish families will be gathering around for Erev Shabbat, for this Kabbalat Shabbat that they've been preparing for all week. And then you put on the garments and you light the candles and you sit down with your family and you bless everyone and you bless the Lord. And everything gets quiet. And there's no electricity and there's no turning on the lights. You know, there's no flipping switches. There's no driving because turn on the ignition. What do? You're turning a spark, making a spark happen. None of those things are going to happen. It's going to be quiet. And we're going to move into that. But you know what? We have 24 hours and Saturday night comes. And what ceremony do we do in a Jewish home at the end of, marking the end of Shabbat? You have a little ceremony where you take spices and you shake them and you smell them. And what are you saying symbolically? You're saying, Lord, I want the smell, the scent of Shabbat to last me for the next 6 days. That even though I have to go back into, quote, space, I've got eternity in my heart. So all days must point to the Sabbath in order to live, because he's put eternity into our souls. And that will sustain us through all these agitations and vicissitudes of life that we have to go through every day, especially under the times today. One time when I was in Israel, I asked what was called a modern Orthodox woman. That's a one little sect. We'll have to one day talk about all the sects of Judaism. It's almost like the Amish I live among here. I thought it was very simple and monolithic, but it's not at all that way. And same with Jewish practice. There are so many, quote, denominations and so many subcategories of Judaism. One of them is this modern Judaism, a modern Orthodoxy. And I was with a woman in Israel, and I asked her, came up that it was going to be a Sabbath. And we were in the Galilee at a hotel, and I asked her if I could sort of spend the Sabbath with her, do what she did, see what it looked like. And of course, when Sabbath ends, you go out and you look at the stars. You know it's Sabbath is ending when you can see the 3 stars. So we went all the way through Sabbath, and did the things together, or didn't do, because I became the Sabbath goy, you know, the Shabbos goy. I would turn on the light switch for her. Okay, so it was kind of an interesting exercise. I enjoyed it a lot and was blessed by it. So especially doing it in Israel. So now we have to ask the question, how does this all help me to know Jesus better? Because in CMJ, whether it's a Shorish travel study program or it's the teaching that we do in our churches or Messianic congregations, we want to look at how all of this helps us understand Jesus better in his setting, the words he said, and all of these other things. So we hear a lot about the Sabbath in the Gospels, right? So we want to know how. We have this beautiful picture that Heschel gives us, for instance, and that Edishine, in his rabbinic background, knowing Jesus now from the 19th century, gives us really many beautiful pictures This eternity in the soul piece, for instance, is a wonderful thing. The idea that God calls us to rest. By the way, God's call to Sabbath rest on the seventh day isn't just an Old Testament idea. It's something that transfers to us, and even scientifically, medical world will tell you it's better to turn the machine off for one day and recover and recuperate. So let's look at some of the things about the Sabbath as interpreted by Jesus and not by the traditions of man. It's interesting to note that it's the Sabbath healings that we read about in the Gospels that are what stirs the religious leaders of his day to begin to plan for his execution. That's how really strongly felt it was about Sabbath. So let's see how Jesus deals with that. Now, one of the stories of a Sabbath story in the Gospels is told in all three of the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In Matthew 12, Mark 3, and Luke 6, the story of Jesus walking with his apostles, his disciples, on a Sabbath day through a grain field. You remember this story, I'm sure. They're picking heads of grain. And what do the Pharisees, the religious leaders, we don't know whether they were walking along with Jesus, whether they were walking along spying on Jesus. It doesn't really tell us that, but they're there. And they say it's unlawful on the Sabbath to be doing what they're doing. Now, what laws are they breaking? What does he think what are they standing on to say you're breaking the Sabbath by doing this? Now, interestingly, Jesus responds to them in that instance, and he says, he uses the story from Samuel about David going into a place where the priest had the showbread, and his soldiers were hungry, his warriors were hungry, and they took the showbread. Jesus always, he has a way of exaggerating for the sake of truth, the very thing that they're throwing up to him to say you're breaking the Sabbath. Now, according to these traditions of men, what is called the oral law, which was prevalent during the time of Jesus, particularly with the Pharisees, what had happened? They said that, I'll give you a basic idea about what the oral law was about. We know that Torah was written by Moses. Okay, they would understand that. And we know that God spoke all manner of things. You can read Leviticus, and all sorts of laws are there. In fact, they will extrapolate 613 laws from the Torah, ultimately. So beyond the 10 Commandments, you get all of these other laws that are within the written Torah. But they said later, well, there were a lot of other things God probably told Moses. And that became the oral law, not written, but oral. And many of these pertain to the Sabbath. There were many other things they wrote down ultimately, which became the Talmud. But in Jesus's day, these things weren't written down. But there was a thing called the oral law, which is referred to in the New Testament as the traditions of man. So Jesus is saying, you have extrapolated so many rules around, and we're going to talk just about the Sabbath today, but he meant broader than that you have made life a burden for good Jewish people who are trying hard to relate to God and to do the right thing and to not sin. So Jesus often is calling the Pharisees particularly down on these traditions of man. And this is one of them, because they had so many laws about what you could not do on the Sabbath that it became a burden. For instance, picking the heads of grain would be one sin against the Sabbath. Okay, probably walking, depending on how far they were walking, they were breaking a rule. Taking the grain and rubbing it between your hands was another sin on the Sabbath, according to the traditions of man, not according to the Torah. So Jesus uses one story from Samuel about David and his warriors, and they're hungry. Now, there is a bottom line Sabbath rule in rabbinics that says that life always trumps Sabbath rules. So, in one side, Jesus is appealing to the underlying rule that life, starvation, being threatened to his warriors, overrules the Sabbath rule that says you can't eat the raw. Now, it's not. This isn't just any bread. This is the bread in the tabernacle. So this is holy bread. And so he kind of draws that point out even stronger in talking to them. But it seems that there's even more to it than that, because he goes on to say, I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. He says, the bottom line above the law of life is God calls for mercy and not sacrifice. He says you're condemning the innocent when you put all of these added laws on to the books. He then goes even farther and says that the Son of Man, that is that word, that title that he takes from the book of Daniel, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Now, that goes way far away, because he's saying, I am the one that has the control over the Sabbath, and I can tell you what the rules are. Because after all, he doesn't say this, but it's implicit. I wrote it. I wrote the book. I know what it is. And I know what the Sabbath is all about. And I know how to make it holy. So this is an outrageous thing for their ears. And it says right after that, they went out and started to plan on how they could bring him to an end, because they saw their rice bowl being threatened. And under their interpretation, using the oral law, he was breaking the law and leading other people to do that. Now, look at another place where he goes into the synagogue. Now, this could have been the same day or another Sabbath. He goes into the synagogue. Maybe he was on his way to the synagogue when this grain eating happened. We're not sure. It's not quite clear, and a little bit different in each one of the synoptic gospels. But he went into their synagogue, and what does he find there? He finds a man with a shriveled hand, and it's the Sabbath. And he asks the question, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Because the leader of the synagogue says, hey, you should do this you got 6 other days to do this healing thing. Don't do it on Sabbath. And Jesus asked, is it lawful then to do good on the Sabbath? He's evoking Deuteronomy 22 there in Matthew 12. So he turns it around and says, they're asking, can you heal on the Sabbath? And he turns it around and asks the real question, is it okay, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil? To save life or to kill? Well, that's a different twist to the way of looking at this, isn't it? And notice in that particular healing in the synagogue, it looks like he calls the man up. Now, Jesus may have been acknowledged as a leader. He's an itinerant rabbi, which was not unusual in those days. And he seems to be up in the front of everybody. He calls this man up, and notice something. He never touches this man. He simply asks the man to stretch out his arm. And what happens when he does? And when he acts in faith? The arm is healed. Life goes into the dead arm. And nobody could say he laid a hand on him. That's a little bit confusing for the rabbis, because they know that underneath it is always the rule for life superseding, and mercy to supersede the Sabbath laws, even their oral laws. Now, you remember in that instance when they could not answer him when he asked, is it right to do good or evil is it right to save life or to kill on the Sabbath? Because he uses another, it says Jesus looked around at them and he was angry and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, because they were making a rule against life and against good for this man who had suffered for so long. And that's when they began to plot to kill him. He also uses the argument. He says in Mark 2, he says the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And that's when he adds, so the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Now, this idea that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. In other words, you should be doing good for man on the Sabbath. That was written down in Jewish rabbinic literature itself. It read like this: the Sabbath is given unto you, not you unto the Sabbath. So Jesus wasn't speaking outside of the rabbinic understanding of Sabbath. He was simply bringing it to their mind and pointing out their hardness of heart in this situation. He also, of course, in several of these Sabbath healings, points out the Levitical rule about a man whose sheep or donkey falls into a pit on the Sabbath. What would you do about that? And it's clear that even for an animal on a Sabbath, you would take mercy on him and you'd get him out of the hole. Because he could die down there. You'd at least give him some food while he was down there. I mean, that's even written in Leviticus. So Jesus is reminding them actually of the Torah as rightly interpreted. And remember that Jesus, in the Mount of Beatitudes, on the Sermon on the Mount, he says, I have not come to destroy the law and the prophets. I've come, and we often translate that to fulfill it. But really what that word in the Greek means is to rightly interpret it. So he is rightly interpreting these Torah laws regarding Sabbath to the very people who are saying we want to keep the law very carefully. Okay, so going on, in Luke 13, the woman, it's a Sabbath healing in the synagogue of a woman who was crippled for 18 years. Now, you have to know that in Judaism, even today, especially today, every letter in the Hebrew alphabet has a numerical value to it. And the word chai, which is chet yod, the two letters, add up numerically to 18. So the word for life in Hebrew is the number 18. Now, do you think it's any mistake that this woman was crippled for 18 years and Jesus wants to bring life to her that day on a Sabbath? Do you think they didn't get that? But the leader of the synagogue said there are 6 days to work, so come and be healed on those days, he says to this crippled woman, not on the Sabbath. And Jesus calls them hypocrites because they've missed the whole point of life. One time in Luke 14, there's a Sabbath healing in a prominent Pharisee's home with a man with dropsy. And so Jesus says to all these Pharisees and experts on the law that are sitting with him, he asked the question again, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? And of course, he heals the man. Now, the Gospel of John is really the penultimate of all Gospels. And we've learned that actually in witnessing to Jewish people, even Morris Rosen, who founded Jews for Jesus, changed his idea about using, for instance, the Old Testament prophecies pointing to the Messiah, which are very good and good for us to know. But he realized that very often using those scriptures, a Jewish person might come to understand that Jesus was in fact the promised Messiah, but they had a problem going from there to deciding that he actually was divine. He was actually God. And so Moish began to take people into.
We lost the volume, Theresa.
I just realized I inadvertently hit the. Okay, so Moish understood then that to take people to the Gospel of John is to really help them see the divinity of Jesus. And so we see, for instance, the rabbis would say that Torah is the word, and that Torah was with God at the beginning of creation. That's a very rabbinic understanding of how eternal Torah is. But John says, what are the first words? In the beginning, starting over Genesis, Bereshit, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was the Word, the living Word, the Logos Word, the Jesus Word was with God, and the Word was God. Okay, there's the divinity of Jesus. So you see how close the idea of Torah being with God in the creation moment, and Jesus being that Word, that Logos in the beginning. That Torah is the written word, but Jesus is the living, eternal word. So it's very important, I think, for us as we think of how we approach Jewish people. I know Jewish people who have been saved by reading the book of John. I have a number of testimonies about that. Chapter 5, you see the Sabbath healing of the invalid at the pool of Bethesda, and he tells him to take up his pallet. Well, that would undo the Pharisees right there. In chapter 7, he talks about you circumcise your children on Sabbath. The priests go into the temple and offer sacrifices, Sabbath sacrifices. Aren't they working? So he calls into question. He's a very good lawyer, Jess. I want you to know. He calls into question the very legal premises that the Pharisees are operating on. And then finally you get to chapter 9 with the man born blind, and Jesus spits into the mud. Well, what's that? That's the creation story all over again. How did God create man in the first place? He made a little mud and put him together. So Jesus bends over and makes that mud, puts it on the man's eyes, and sends him off to the pool of Siloam. And it's a Sabbath. And so the Pharisees are outraged. And they say, this man can't be from God because he doesn't keep the Sabbath. Okay. So, and finally we get to the Samaritan woman at the well in chapter 4, which is wonderful when he says, because this is where I think the strongest words from Jesus does the Heschel from space to time. When he says to this wonderful Samaritan woman that he meets at Jacob's well, what a setting this is. Jesus says, a time is coming, starting about verse 21, a time is coming when you will worship the Father, neither on this mountain, meaning Gerizim, where the Samaritans worshiped, or in Jerusalem. A time is coming and has now come, because he's it. He is the Shabbat. It's when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks. God is spirit, and his worshipers must worship in spirit and truth. And it's very interesting that both the Pharisees and the Samaritans had a place to worship. That's that space place. But Jesus is saying very clearly, there's coming a time when we'll move into eternity. The Father is a spirit. He wants to be worshiped in spirit and time. He wants us to be forever in Shabbat, into that eternity place with him in the spirit. Now, Edishine in his book points out that there are 39 no-nos for the Sabbath, with a whole bunch of subcategories under those 39 of what you can't do on the Sabbath. Okay. He has a whole, Edishine in his book has a whole appendix on all of the Mishnah rules, the Mishnah tractate called Sabbath, on all the things that you can't do. You can't carry, you can't look in a mirror, you can't walk so far. You can't sew, pile, knead, winnow, bake, spin, make a knot, pin on a brooch. It just goes on and on and on. It's endless. So these are things that we must think on. Now I love Rich Robinson's book, which I highly recommend. You can get it through Jews for Jesus, or you can just get it, I think, on Amazon, because he's very practical. He gives you both sides of it all, and he has some wonderful things that he talks about in summarizing Jesus and all of these places that he talks to in much more detail than I could have time to go into. He believes that we believers in Jesus, he's a Jewish believer himself, are to take a Sabbath rest for sure, but without the legalism attached to it. We have to think ourselves on how we will rest in God, how we move into the Spirit with God, and make plans. And I think to really enjoy the Sabbath ourselves, I do encourage people to do an Erev Shabbat meal. I think both to relate ourselves to the Jewish people, not to try to be Jewish because we're not, but to understand the beauty of that Sabbath rest, but also beyond that, understand what a blessing and a gift this call to rest is, and to rest always in the Spirit. And for your homework, I want you to read Hebrews. That's another whole teaching, but Hebrews 4-10 really talks about this, that God, on the seventh day, God rested from his work, that he finished his creation. But then he says, the writer of Hebrews says to this Jewish community in the diaspora who are about to step back from practicing as believers, Jewish believers, because now Christianity is outlawed under Roman law, but Judaism is still a legal religion under the Jewish law. So they stand to be persecuted as believers in Jesus, though they're Jewish. But it would be easier to fall back into Judaism and not be persecuted. Oh, that's a temptation to us all, isn't it? We'd like to escape persecution if we can. But the writer of Hebrews says there remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. I want you to think on those things.